In yesterday's lesson, we read in Luke chapter 2 about Joseph and Mary going to Bethlehem because of the worldwide census ordered by Caesar Augustus. When they got there, they discovered that the city was bustling with people and overcrowded and overpopulated because of the census. When they went to the inn, there was no room in the inn. We described that inn and the poverty setting that it must have been. Today I want to focus a little bit upon the innkeeper. I mentioned yesterday that we are often harsh when it comes to our judgment and assessment of the innkeeper. He meant no harm. The inn was simply full. But yet I want to look at this a little closer. I think there's several things we can learn from the innkeeper about our own relationship to the child that was being carried by Mary that day when they knocked on the door. There's several reasons probably why Mary and Joseph were turned away, and thus why Jesus was turned away at the inn. I want to share one of those with you today out of Luke 2:7, where it says, "And there was no room for them in the inn." I think one of the reasons Jesus was turned away was simply because the innkeeper was too busy. Here's a businessman who owned an inn. He had never had such a good day or a good week in his entire life. Probably the only people who ever stopped by his inn were some caravans coming from Egypt to some strange place in Israel. Bethlehem was not a big city, it was a small city. And this innkeeper may have had a couple of folks on a regular occasion who would come and maybe spend the night, but this particular night his inn was jammed packed. In our language, we would say the convention is in town and all the rooms are sold out. I laugh when I read this story and think I'm sure that he probably doubled his prices. You know, the good old law of supply and demand. Everybody was coming to Bethlehem, so his inn was full. Can you imagine him getting up early in the morning and people coming in from everywhere standing at the door? He was busy all day making sure every need was met. He was busy all day counting his money. He was having a great day. I'm sure by the end of the night he is bone tired. He's probably never worked so hard in his whole life. And when he thinks his day is over and he's ready to retire, there's one more knock on the door. He opens the door and it's this shabby looking couple who obviously don't have much. They may not have even had enough money to pay for the room. But he opens the door. He's tired, the inn's full, and here's this one more couple wanting a room. And to beat everything, she's pregnant. He was just too busy and too tired to hear that story. Again, before you're too critical, have you ever been that way? Come on now, seriously. Have you ever gotten one of those sales calls on the telephone and you're just too tired to mess with this stuff? So you say, "Hey, I know this is your job and you're probably doing a good job and you're a good person, but I'm tired. And I'm going to hang up right now if that's all right with you." You know you've done it. Except you weren't that nice when you did it, were you? That's the way the innkeeper was, I'm sure. He was dead tired. He didn't care to hear their story. He'd been working all day and he's totally exhausted. And he had no time to be concerned about this strange couple standing at the door. As I reflected on this, I realized that sometimes we're that way with Jesus, and sometimes we're that way with each other. Many years ago, I was in Columbia, South Carolina, teaching a national seminar for a mission board across North America. I got up one morning and I read the newspaper before I went out to teach that morning. Here's the story that I read about that morning. The night before in Columbia, South Carolina, a lady had been picked up by 5 men. She was raped continuously by these 5 men. She finally was able to break away from the men, and she ran from them. She ran down the streets screaming. Door after door she banged on, begging people to call the police or to help her. But everybody was too tired or too busy, and they kept shutting the door. She kept this up until finally those 5 men overtook her again and raped her 10 more times. The people in that neighborhood were simply too busy or too scared to help somebody at the door. That's a sad and tragic story. Yet, all of us reach the point in our life sometimes when we're just too busy or too preoccupied with our own lives to care or help other people. We're too tired to listen to other people's problems. We got our own problems. Yet as believers, we're supposed to be the ears of Jesus in a world that desperately needs a listening ear, but we're too tired to listen. Sometimes we're that way with Jesus. Sometimes we're that way with our families. We're just too busy, too preoccupied, too tired to listen and to care. Many years ago, I read a story in a state newspaper from a local pastor who had told the story about Thomas Carlyle. Thomas Carlyle was the famous author. Finally, Thomas Carlyle married his longtime secretary, who he had been in love with for many years. Yet after they got married, he was thoughtless about her. He was obsessed and absorbed with his own thoughts and activities, and he continued to treat his wife much like he had treated her when she was his employee. It wasn't long after they got married that Carlyle's wife was stricken with cancer, and she ended up confined to her bed and was never able to get out of the bed. She literally laid on that bed until she died. After the funeral, Carlyle went back to his empty house, walked around downstairs, disconsolate, grieving, and depressed. Finally, he wandered upstairs into the room where she had laid for all this time. He sat down in the chair right beside her bed. It was then he realized he had not sat in that chair nearly enough and had not talked to her nearly enough while she was sick. He noticed her diary sitting on the little table by the bed. He'd never read it before. He had respected her privacy and thought it would be wrong to read it. But now she was gone, and he saw no reason not to read it. So he picked it up and he began to read page after page. On one particular day's entry, his eye was caught by what she had written that day. She wrote, "Yesterday, he spent an hour with me. It was like being in heaven. I love him so much." He turned a couple of more pages and read, "I listened all day today to hear his steps in the hall. But now I guess it's too late. I guess he's not coming by to see me today." Carlyle continued to read through her diary until he couldn't read it anymore. He put it down and ran down the steps and ran through the rain to the cemetery. He fell across her muddy grave and began to weep and sob, saying, "If only I had known, if only I had known." The pastor who shared this story said these words could easily have been turned into saying, "If only I had thought. If I hadn't been so busy to stop and think about the needs of somebody else, I wouldn't be standing here regretting what I've done." The man didn't mean any harm. Carlyle didn't mean any harm either. He was just too busy. That's the way it was with the innkeeper. Guys, we get so caught up in the things we're doing, we get too busy for each other. And God forbid we get too busy for Jesus. There are a lot of people in our lives who are hurting emotionally, financially, and spiritually. We're being robbed of joy, and we're being robbed of victory, and we're being robbed of strength because we're too busy to give God time in our day. I think of that poor innkeeper. I wish history had told us something else about him. I wish the Bible would have told us what happened to him in later years. Wouldn't you like to know if one day he woke up and realized who was born in his stable? Wouldn't you like to know if he ever really received Jesus into his heart? If he ever became a believer or follower of Christ? I'd like to know what his thoughts were when he realized what he had missed. Well, we'll never know this side of heaven. I tell you what, I don't want to know. I don't want to wake up and look at myself and think, if only I'd given God more time. If only I'd given my family more time. If only I'd given God's work more time. Look at what could have happened. Too many of us have no vacancy signs on the hearts of our lives because we're just too busy to spend time with God and those we love. Think about it. Tomorrow, we'll look at another reason why Jesus was turned away.